The US Coast Guard has just confirmed wreckage from the crash has been located. But now, the real search begins. What exactly went wrong in Alaska? In the quiet expanse of the far north, where frozen runways stretch toward misty horizons, disaster struck with no warning. Anchorage's Ted Stevens International Airport, one of the world's busiest cargo hubs and a key artery for trans-Pacific air traffic, was forced into an immediate shutdown after a catastrophic runway accident shook the aviation world. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe for more updates like this one. It began like any other day in Alaska. Crews accustomed to the region's brutal cold were fully prepared to handle the usual operational challenges. But this day was different. No amount of training could have stopped what unfolded next. A large cargo aircraft, operated by a globally trusted freight company, started its takeoff from runway 15, one of the longest runways in North America. Within seconds of powering up, something went terribly wrong. A sudden catastrophic systems failure left the crew with no time to react. Witnesses reported the jet veering sharply off course just as it reached takeoff speed. One of its landing gears buckled, possibly due to an undetected mechanical fault or stress from the intense cold. The aircraft skidded at a dangerous angle, its wing clipping a nearby fuel truck that had only just cleared the runway. The resulting explosion sent fire and smoke billowing into the Alaskan sky, visible from miles away. Emergency crews raced in, but the front half of the jet was already engulfed in flames. What makes this incident even more chilling is how close it came to becoming one of the worst aviation disasters in US history. Less than 100 feet away sat a fully loaded passenger jet awaiting clearance to taxi. Had the cargo plane veered just slightly further, the resulting collision could have claimed hundreds of lives. Investigators would later describe the scene as something out of a nightmare: twisted wreckage, scorched tarmac, and debris scattered across a runway that just hours earlier had been operating smoothly. Anchorage's entire airport came to a standstill. Flights were immediately grounded or diverted, some rerouted as far away as Seattle. Federal and local agencies converged on the airport, transforming it into a maze of flashing lights, barricades, and investigation teams. But the real reason for the airport-wide shutdown wasn't just the explosion. It was the uncertainty. No one knew the full scope of the failure. Was it a mechanical issue? A collapse in the landing gear or hydraulic system? Or something deeper, perhaps tied to the region's harsh weather, infrastructure stress, or missed safety protocols? Alaska's aviation facilities are among the most weather-hardened on Earth, but even the most resilient systems can crack under the pressure of relentless freeze-thaw cycles and sub-zero extremes. Though the runway had cleared inspection just days earlier, the accident cast a long shadow over its integrity. As investigators combed the wreckage, speculation grew. And Anchorage isn't just another airport, it's a strategic global waypoint. It plays a critical role in both commercial cargo and military logistics between Asia and North America. A shutdown here doesn't just delay flights, it disrupts international shipping networks and national security operations. Within hours, the ripple effects spread across the global transport system. Deliveries were delayed, airline schedules were thrown into chaos. Cargo pilots were left grounded in remote hotels, and an entire supply chain built on precision timing was suddenly frozen. The airport that once symbolized seamless, unstoppable movement had come to a screeching halt. The challenges didn't end with the explosion, they had only just begun. Recovery efforts in midwinter Anchorage are anything but simple. Snow fell fast, blanketing vital evidence. Investigators raced against time to locate black boxes before ice made the search nearly impossible. Fire-retardant chemicals, instead of clearing the way, froze solid across the tarmac, turning cleanup into a hazardous and slow-moving task. At the same time, engineers were forced to assess the runway's condition. The surface had been deeply gouged and partially melted by the heat of the blaze. With millions of dollars lost every hour due to grounded flights and diverted cargo, time was money. But the runways remained eerily quiet. Only the sound of boots crunching snow and the low groan of heavy machinery echoed through the silence. But the physical damage was only part of the story. Pilots flying into Anchorage reported a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Tension hung heavy in the cockpit. Already known for its harsh conditions and few alternate landing sites, Anchorage had always demanded respect from flight crews. Now it carried a new weight, the awareness that disaster could strike even during routine operations. Airlines began re-evaluating their risk protocols. Training drills were updated to include real-life scenarios based on what had just happened in Alaska. Meanwhile, the global cargo industry was left scrambling. Anchorage is no ordinary airport, it's a cornerstone of trans-Pacific freight. Its location saves hours on routes between Asia and the US, and its closure forced aircraft to reroute as far as Los Angeles or Calgary. This added hours to delivery times and strained hubs that weren't prepared for the overflow. Industries dependent on tight schedules, like tech production, pharmaceutical shipping, and global e-commerce, started feeling the pressure. Delays, reroutes, and unexpected costs began stacking up across the board. And then came the deeper questions. Though aircraft mishaps have occurred in Alaskan skies before, the scale of this event raised red flags about long-standing vulnerabilities. Was this just a one-off failure, or part of a broader pattern? Aviation watchdogs quickly called for sweeping reviews, from maintenance routines and inspection standards to runway infrastructure and emergency protocols. Everything was on the table. Smaller regional airports, already operating on tight budgets, feared the fallout. Increased scrutiny could mean reduced traffic, tightened regulations, or even funding cuts. Federal agencies responded fast. Teams from the FAA and NTSB were on site within hours. But this wasn't just about writing an incident report. They were investigating a much bigger picture. How resilient is America's northernmost air network? Are our systems prepared for crisis in the world's harshest environments? Initial findings hinted at a mix of factors: a mechanical issue, possibly worsened by icy conditions, a component that passed inspection but failed under stress, and an environment that magnified every weakness. But no clear cause had yet emerged, and no one could say for certain why the safeguards didn't work. As official answers lagged, public speculation filled the void. News outlets broadcast dramatic footage captured by airport cameras and onlookers. Online forums buzzed with amateur sleuths analyzing satellite images, flight data, and eyewitness accounts. One haunting image began circulating widely: a jet engulfed in flames surrounded by snow, a visual metaphor for both vulnerability and resilience. This was no longer just an aviation story. The state of Alaska took action. Emergency meetings were held to assess broader transportation security. Because for Alaska, this wasn't just about one airport, it was about the state's very lifeline. Much of Alaska is cut off from the continental US by road. Ted Stevens International Airport is the main artery through which supplies, medicine, food, and equipment flow. Even a brief closure sends ripple effects through towns and villages hundreds of miles away. Some grocery stores in remote communities began reporting shortages. Hospitals rushed to place early orders for life-saving medications, fearful that the cold chain supply could falter. The shutdown didn't just interrupt operations, it exposed a truth most Alaskans know all too well: how fragile the state's infrastructure really is. In the aftermath, the financial shockwaves were immediate. Insurance firms scrambled to estimate the scale of what was unfolding. A destroyed aircraft, a damaged runway, and broken service agreements created a mountain of claims. Freight companies, airport service providers, and logistics partners were suddenly tangled in a legal maze of accountability and compensation. At the same time, decision-makers faced tough, uncomfortable questions. Should more be invested in reinforcing infrastructure in high-risk regions like Alaska? Could better regulations have prevented this? Or is this simply the cost of doing business at the edge of the world, where weather, terrain, and remoteness constantly push the limits of human control? As the airport remained closed, a quiet but undeniable sense of reckoning spread throughout the aviation world. For decades, global air travel has focused on speed, precision, and connectivity. But the Anchorage disaster threw a wrench into that momentum. It was a stark reminder: resilience matters just as much as efficiency. Even standard procedures can unravel when conditions shift just enough. It was also a wake-up call that no frontier, Alaska or otherwise, is immune to disruption if the systems behind it aren't built to endure the unexpected. Conversations changed overnight. Inside flight operations centers, redundancy protocols were re-examined. Cold weather testing standards were tightened. Pilots operating in volatile climates were given broader discretion to reroute before conditions spiraled out of control. Efficiency took a back seat to caution, and urgency was replaced by deliberation. Meanwhile, Anchorage's skies remained unusually quiet, a haunting symbol of everything that had gone wrong below. Eventually, the burned-out fuselage was lifted away, exposing the deep scars left behind on the runway. Scars that would take days, maybe weeks, to repair. With every hour the airport remained offline, the ripple effects grew larger. Anchorage's long-standing rhythm had been broken, but beneath the physical damage, a deeper truth emerged. In a world that leans heavily on air travel, not just for commerce, but for critical supplies, emergency services, and national readiness, there is very little room for failure. One incident, one failure in the chain, can halt entire systems built on precision and timing. And in Alaska, where industry, environment, and isolation collide with unrelenting force, that margin for error is razor-thin. As investigations expanded and the shutdown wore on, another story began to surface, not about logistics, but about people. Behind every report and press release were those living the reality. The flight crew who narrowly escaped a deadly outcome, the ground workers whose routine shift turned into a disaster zone, the control tower operators who made impossible decisions in real time. Anchorage isn't just a waypoint for international freight, it's a lifeline for Alaska. Thousands depend on it, not just for goods and services, but for jobs, security, and connection to the outside world. The closure's impact quickly moved beyond economics. It disrupted the heartbeat of an entire region. Airline employees were benched indefinitely. Independent drivers, whose livelihoods depended on steady shipments, were left idle. Local hotels, usually bustling with transient air crews, cargo handlers, and technicians, faced sudden and sharp losses. What began as a terrifying aircraft incident was evolving into a full-scale regional emergency. Inside the operations center, pressure mounted by the hour. The teams responsible for clearing debris, managing fuel logistics, restoring communications, and coordinating relief worked around the clock, battling the cold, physical exhaustion, and bureaucratic delays. Each passing day brought more challenges. The fire's chemical suppressants had spread wider than expected, contaminating key areas. Shrapnel from the explosion had fused into the icy runway, requiring high-tech imaging tools and radar surveys just to assess the damage. This was no ordinary cleanup, it was a test of endurance, infrastructure, and coordination at the edge of the world. Behind the scenes, the digital heartbeat of the airport had fallen silent. The systems that once buzzed with real-time updates, transponder pings, and freight manifests went still. With no planes coming or going, the software designed to manage logistics simply stopped working. Automation hit a wall, and suddenly it was all hands on deck. Logistics teams scrambled. Thousands of packages, many critical and time-sensitive, had to be rerouted manually. In bitter cold, workers resorted to pen, paper, radios, and sheer determination, sorting, reclassifying, and rebooking shipments without the digital backbone they usually relied on. Technology had paused, but people hadn't. It became a raw test of human grit. Adaptability replaced automation, and as the crisis deepened, the ripple effects reached far beyond the airport's perimeter. At the national level, defense analysts began sounding alarms. Alaska isn't just remote, it's a strategic asset, a watchtower for Arctic surveillance and Pacific defense. With a key transport hub offline, the military was forced to reroute operations through less efficient corridors, stretching resources and raising concerns about future readiness in this high-stakes region. While the cause of the incident wasn't linked to foul play or a cyber attack, its consequences felt eerily similar to the fallout of an infrastructure strike, an unsettling scenario that defense planners could no longer ignore. In aviation circles, a different storm was brewing. Technical forums lit up with debates and speculation. What kind of mechanical failure could escape detection in routine pre-flight checks? Maintenance records were scrutinized. The aircraft's age and cold weather performance history came under the microscope. Some engineers pointed to takeoff stress in sub-zero temperatures, warning that hairline fractures, too small to catch during inspections, may have played a fatal role. Others suggested older plane models, pushed to their limits by the post-pandemic cargo boom, were simply no longer built for today's demands. Meanwhile, a cultural reckoning was taking shape across Alaska. On the airwaves and online, frustration grew. Residents questioned how so much of the state's survival, food, fuel, medicine, could hinge on a single choke point. When that link broke, everything else began to break with it. The solution? Decentralization. Could a network of smaller, more rugged airstrips reduce dependence on mega-hubs? Should the federal government invest in hardening critical infrastructure across remote states like Alaska, where a simple disruption becomes a full-scale emergency? Off-grid communities felt the brunt of it. Deliveries of essentials like insulin and baby formula were delayed. Bush pilots, already stretched thin, were bombarded with urgent delivery requests. Fuel prices soared as the supply chain staggered. What began as one crash had exposed the fragile backbone of Alaska's logistics system. Even morale in the aviation world took a hit. Pilots, trained for worst-case scenarios, now had a chilling case study of how fast a situation could unravel. Flight unions called for updated training focused on extreme environments. Many argued that traditional certifications didn't prepare crews for the brutal conditions and high-stakes decision-making required in places like Anchorage. Flight attendants, ground crew, and technicians echoed these concerns. Safety reviews, they insisted, must include voices from the front lines, not just corporate boardrooms. Airlines faced tough choices. Some pulled out of Anchorage routes altogether, citing safety concerns and uncertainty. Others rerouted traffic through backup airports in the Pacific Northwest or Canada, only to face new hurdles: limited cargo space, under-equipped terminals, and delays caused by unfamiliar logistics setups. What had started as an isolated accident had grown into a multi-layered crisis, one that exposed not just a structural failure, but a systemic one. When Anchorage went dark, the world's flight paths lit up in chaos. Overnight, global shipping routes had to be reimagined. What used to be a quick hop through Alaska now became a complex detour, taking days instead of hours. The incident exposed just how delicate modern logistics really are, especially those built on razor-thin margins and just-in-time delivery models. Suddenly, companies had to dust off outdated contingency plans they'd long since shelved for the sake of speed and efficiency. And they weren't the only ones forced to rethink everything. Insurance firms and risk analysts faced a harsh reality check. Their tried and tested models for calculating liability in cold weather regions no longer felt reliable. Were they accounting enough for extreme weather? Had they underestimated aging infrastructure or overtrusted old aircraft still in service? These weren't theoretical questions anymore. They were now urgent matters of global risk. As the dust settled, reinsurance providers began tightening the rules. New restrictions emerged for cargo operations flying over the Arctic and subarctic corridors. The financial safety nets, once taken for granted, were no longer so certain. Meanwhile, aviation schools and training academies treated the Anchorage disaster as a wake-up call. Syllabi were rewritten. New training modules focused on emergency response in remote, low-resource environments. Flight simulators were upgraded to replicate the unique challenges seen in the incident. Future pilots were being taught not just to navigate airspace, but to stay composed during cascading system failures when rescue might be hours away. But the human cost wasn't the only concern. Environmental questions loomed. The blast and resulting fire had released harmful substances: jet fuel, carbon particles, chemical suppressants. Activists and scientists wanted answers. How much had seeped into the frozen soil? Would spring meltwater carry toxins into rivers and habitats? Anchorage lies on the edge of fragile ecosystems. home to migratory birds, marine wildlife, and indigenous communities reliant on clean water and healthy land. Cleanup crews weren't just clearing wreckage anymore. They were joined by environmental researchers trying to limit long-term damage. And then came the bigger issue: climate vulnerability. Alaska's cold is no stranger to aviation, but the new instability in weather patterns is. Erratic freeze-thaw cycles have become more common, stressing infrastructure. Runways now buckle under shifting permafrost. Snow patterns are less predictable, complicating maintenance and ploughing schedules. While this crash stemmed from mechanical failure, it spotlighted a deeper, slower-moving threat: the cumulative toll of climate change on aviation safety. Anchorage remained silent. The usual hum of engines and cargo lifts was replaced with the mechanical scrape of cleanup crews and the low thrum of helicopters ferrying investigators. What they uncovered wasn't simplicity, but layers of complexity. Each clue raised more questions than it answered. The black boxes had been found. Analysis revealed that the crew had only seconds between detecting the fault and impact. Not enough time to save the flight, yet just enough time to know it was coming. In Washington, the silence triggered action. Behind closed doors, congressional hearings were being scheduled. Lawmakers demanded briefings on how one hub going offline could throw national logistics into disarray. Experts were summoned, from aviation safety to infrastructure strategy to national defense. Was Anchorage a tragic outlier? Or was it the first clear warning of a system stretched too thin? Support was rising, but so was the pressure. In Washington, bipartisan backing grew for emergency funding to strengthen remote airport infrastructure. But beneath that unity was a sobering realization. Without deeper structural change, this could happen again, somewhere else, or worse. The world was watching. For decades, Anchorage had been a critical node in the global cargo network, especially for trans-Pacific carriers who saw it as a dependable, time-saving refueling stop. Now its reliability was in question. Major airlines from Europe and Asia quietly began plotting alternative routes, drafting emergency logistics plans that bypassed Alaska entirely. While many said the shift was temporary, industry analysts weren't so sure. Even a brief disruption, they warned, could redraw global air traffic in ways that lingered for years. Anchorage, once a keystone in high-latitude aviation, was no longer untouchable. Until it proved otherwise, it was viewed as a risk. But the impact wasn't just global, it was deeply personal. Within Alaska, the incident left a mark on the cultural psyche. Resilience is part of life here, but the scale of this disruption was something else entirely. It sparked an emotional response. Short films from local filmmakers captured the eerie quiet of a snow-covered airport in lockdown. Artists painted fire-lit runways bleeding into icy night skies. Poets wrote elegies to the sound that vanished from the sky. It was more than just an accident. It became a story Alaskans would carry. And under all the storytelling and soul-searching lay a haunting truth. The accident exposed not just mechanical failures, but a fragility within the systems we trust every day. In our age of hyperconnectivity, of precision, speed, and automation, one break in one remote corner of the world had sent ripples through the entire global machine. The repairs began without fanfare. Crews worked quietly through the cold, laying down heated concrete to protect fresh runway surfaces from frost damage. No ribbon cuttings, no statements, just a slow, careful return to function, this time shadowed by memory. Planes would return. So would fuel transfers and time-sensitive cargo. But the airport itself had changed. What once felt indestructible now showed scars, not just in the asphalt, but in the mindset of everyone who depended on it. This was no ordinary restoration. This was reinforcement. In the background, the most intense inspection in the airport's history was underway. Engineers scanned every inch of runway with laser tools and radar systems, mapping out microscopic fractures and potential shifts in the frozen ground. This wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about making sure nothing else could break without warning. Inside operations centers, a new philosophy was taking hold. The old mantra, efficiency first, was no longer sacred. Now caution was king. Redundancy was no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Safety protocols were layered thick. Where once automation reigned, human oversight was reinstated, not as a backup, but as a partner. Internal checks became more stringent, routine became rigorous, and the smallest irregularity that might once have slipped by was now a red flag demanding full review. In the aftermath, a quiet transformation had begun. Anchorage was returning to the map, but differently, not just as a waypoint, but as a symbol of how quickly certainty can be shaken. The facility was operational again, but surrounded by a quiet vigilance. And as the low sun hovered over the frozen landscape, it cast long shadows over freshly patched ground, reminding everyone that resilience isn't built on assumptions, but on constant attention. Because at the edge of the world, safety isn't permanent. It's earned, daily, deliberately, and one runway at a time. While crews on the ground worked to recover Anchorage's runways, a quieter but equally urgent reckoning was happening behind the scenes. Across the aviation world, data scientists and risk analysts began re-examining long-held assumptions about flight operations in extreme environments. For decades, models had shown Anchorage and places like it to be dependable, but those models had been built on years of climate stability. That stability was now gone. As weather became more volatile, so did the systems that depended on it. Desync schedules were no longer predictable. Maintenance cycles couldn't rely on averages. Algorithms once trusted to assess risk were suddenly outdated. Industry-wide, predictive models had to evolve, not just to track hours in the air, but to account for unpredictable exposure to cold, wind, and thermal shock. And this ripple didn't stop with airlines. Global insurers took notice. Companies managing freight, logistics, and transcontinental shipping began reclassifying Arctic and subarctic routes. Anchorage, long prized for its speed and strategic location, was now marked high risk. Insurance premiums spiked, contracts were rewritten. Clients no longer trusted fragile, just-in-time supply chains. Warehouses expanded. Backups were built in. What had once been streamlined became layered with buffers. Anchorage, once a model of efficiency, had become a warning. Carriers that once depended on it as a midpoint between continents began exploring alternatives. Longer routes through warmer climates were considered a safer bet. Some logistics companies proposed spreading their networks, favoring smaller, more predictable hubs in Hawaii, Vancouver, or northern Japan. Even the US government had to respond. The FAA, long confident in America's airport infrastructure, even in places like Alaska, now faced a new reality. Resilience, not just compliance, had to be the goal. Task forces were formed to rethink cold region aviation. Engineers tested heated runway materials. Autonomous vehicles were developed to navigate blizzards and low visibility emergencies. The standard wasn't just safety, it was adaptability. Meanwhile, researchers and climatologists teamed up. They investigated how micro-icing and freeze-thaw cycles impacted aircraft during taxi, takeoff, and landing. The Anchorage failure had exposed something often overlooked. The danger wasn't only in the sky, it was right there on the tarmac. Tiny imperfections in wheels or sensors could become catastrophic in sub-zero conditions. This gave rise to an emerging field. Arctic aeronautics, an intersection of atmospheric science, mechanical engineering, and crisis planning. Back home in Alaska, the shift was deeply felt. Vocational schools reported surging enrollment in fields like cold weather mechanics, aviation safety, and emergency logistics. For many young Alaskans, the airport incident hit close to home. What once felt like a distant industry had suddenly become vital and vulnerable. The silence of the grounded planes stirred something in them: purpose. And beyond Alaska, others were paying attention. States like North Dakota, Montana, and regions of northern New England began their own internal reviews. Their geography might not be as isolated, but the risks were familiar. A single failure at the wrong airport could cut off entire communities. Emergency plans were updated. Supplies were stockpiled. Some states even drafted agreements to help each other if disaster struck. The Anchorage shutdown was more than an accident. It was a catalyst, A wake-up call for an industry built on precision, now forced to confront chaos. If you found this story eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dive explorations into global infrastructure and resilience. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us, should global aviation be doing more to prepare for the unexpected? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.